Hello everyone, let's dive into another lesson by Olavo de Carvalho. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like so we can continue our work. The reference video for this lesson is in the description. Let's get started. Good afternoon everyone, and welcome. I'd like to use a letter I recently received as the theme for this class. The class was already somewhat planned before I got the letter, but it fits the subject matter so well that I'll use it as a pretext. The letter is from Luis Carneiro. Dear Master Olavo, how are you? With every lesson I attend in this course, I feel my understanding of my existence becoming less opaque, and I become more aware of how vast the path to sincere truth is. Considering I spent many years entangled in false concepts and attitudes that don't lead to genuine philosophy. Thank you very much. Regarding the lesson from July 11th, in which you spoke about truth and sincerity, I immediately recalled Søren Kierkegaard's philosophy. In one of his texts, Provocation, compiled by Charles Moore, he explained that truth is not a matter of knowing this or that, but of being in it. I would like to know if this reflects the sense of truth discussed in that lesson. For the most part, yes. At the end of my notes, the problem of truth is the real problem. I say exactly this. Truth is a domain in which you are either inside or outside. Existentially, you are always within it. Psychologically and cognitively, however, you sometimes are and sometimes aren't. I believe this class will clarify much of this issue. Let me begin with a little story. At the University of Iowa, researchers conducted an experiment where they set up 4 decks of cards, 2 red decks and 2 blue decks. Participants were asked to pick cards from any of the decks. Depending on the card they turned over, they would either win a sum of money or have to pay a sum of money. The cards, however, weren't evenly distributed. Cards from the red decks offered high rewards but even higher penalties. For instance, you might win $500 with one card, but lose $1,000 with another. On the other hand, the blue decks offered smaller rewards but also smaller penalties. For example, you might win $50 or lose $10. The researchers observed that it took participants around 50 card draws to realize that the distribution was not random, and that it was more advantageous to pick from the blue decks. After 50 draws, participants started to prefer the blue decks. Participants were hooked up to a machine measuring the sweat on their hands, which is a clear indicator of stress. The researchers noticed that stress levels began to rise when participants picked a card from the red decks starting around the 10th draw. From that point onward, participants began to instinctively choose fewer red cards and more blue ones, even though they hadn't consciously realized what was happening. By the 80th draw, participants were able to articulate the rules of the game entirely. On average, it took 50 draws to perceive that the red decks were biased and 80 to mentally describe the game's rules. Interestingly, the machine detected increased hand sweat near the red decks after just 10 draws. This suggests participants were already making decisions to favor the blue decks 40 draws before they consciously realized it. Psychologists referred to this phenomenon as adaptive unconscious, which they distinguish from Freud's unconscious. Freud's unconscious is like a repository of undesirable thoughts and memories, while the adaptive unconscious is a mechanism that allows individuals to adjust to situations before they consciously understand them. This experiment demonstrates 2 distinct decision-making processes at work. One unconscious, where decisions are made before the participant is fully aware, and the other conscious, where reasoning occurs through trial and error, accumulating evidence to reach a conclusion. Psychologists aptly described the phenomenon of the adaptive unconscious, and the experiment is illuminating. However, their analysis falls short because psychology as a field only studies what happens within the psyche. It doesn't explore the relationship between cognitive processes and the objects of cognition. Psychologists focus solely on the subjective side of the story, which prevents them from delving into deeper levels of analysis. They fail to consider the connection between the mind, the subject of cognition, and the actual situation. The real-world context lies outside psychology's scope. This is where our analysis comes in. The normal, longer process of learning, the one occurring between the 50th and 80th draws, is a typical example of inductive reasoning. We gather multiple pieces of evidence, observe patterns, and formulate a hypothetical rule to explain both past and future cases. For instance, if the blue cards have consistently been advantageous so far, one can hypothesize a general rule behind this pattern. Recognizing this general rule allows us to encompass all known cases and anticipate future ones. But what about the initial, intuitive decision-making process after the 10th draw? Psychologists often label this as unconscious intuition or instinct, but it's clear that inductive reasoning is also involved here. After just 10 cards, the participant already has a pattern to consider. The increased sweat when approaching the red decks after 10 draws indicates an inductive reasoning process happening, albeit subconsciously. While conscious reasoning might require 50 cases to form a hypothesis, this other process works with fewer cases, drawing conclusions far earlier. From a logical structure perspective, the reasoning is equally inductive in both cases. The only difference is that the earlier reasoning is subconscious, while the later one is conscious. This distinction between conscious and subconscious reasoning is secondary. It's more important to consider the materials each process uses. Conscious reasoning involves symbols, memories, and representations of past situations. Subconscious reasoning, on the other hand, deals directly with the objects and facts of the present situation. The first type of reasoning is immediate and based on direct interaction with reality, while the second relies on representations created by the mind. This distinction is crucial for understanding how we engage with truth and knowledge. Imagine a situation where someone with a menacing expression approaches you holding a knife. You perceive their intention to harm you based on their immediate actions. This means you are drawing a conclusion about what might happen next, directly from the situation at hand. You didn't have time to mentally transform that threatening figure into a mental symbol, recall similar past situations, compare them, and deduce that the person intends to harm you. There wasn't enough time for such reasoning. In this case, you're not reasoning with mental signs, but directly with the present object. It's clear that we are dealing with two different kinds of logical connections here. One type is the logical connection evident in the objects and the sequence of events themselves. The other is a mental or logical connection reproduced in your thoughts after the fact. When we immediately perceive such a situation, we are often uncertain about what is happening. That's why we call it a hunch or vague intuition. In contrast, when we compose a full logical reasoning process, verify it, and arrive at a conclusion, we say we are certain. But where does certainty come from? The first reasoning process is no less valid or accurate than the second. It's still inductive reasoning. The difference is that in the second case, you consciously constructed the reasoning process, step by step. You dominate the reasoning process entirely because you created it. And this perceived control over your own reasoning gives you a false sense of cognitive mastery over the situation itself. However, the first reasoning process, being more directly connected to the facts of the situation, is actually far more reliable. It doesn't rely on representations or symbols that can introduce errors, but instead works directly with the data of reality. Modern education and culture, however, encourage us to trust the second type of reasoning and doubt the first. We dismiss the first as mere intuition, impression, or hunch, while elevating the second as rational and scientifically confirmable. Yet the second process appears more reliable only because it is entirely under our mental control. In truth, It merely connects concepts, not the facts themselves. The logical connection between concepts might represent the factual connection, but it is not the same as the factual connection. The subjects in the Iowa experiment, between their 50th and 80th draws, began constructing theories and hypotheses. These theories sometimes differed from one another. One participant would explain the situation one way, another differently. However, the reaction to the red decks observed starting from the 10th draw, the increased sweating, was identical for everyone. This demonstrates that reliance on logical conscious reasoning can be deceptive because such reasoning deals only with concepts, not direct realities. In the first case, you are dealing directly with the situation as it unfolds. In the second case, you're working with a set of concepts representing that situation. The intuitive perception from the 10th draw was not vague or uncertain. It followed the same inductive structure as the later reasoning. The perceived uncertainty comes only from the fact that the connection is presented by external reality rather than constructed by your own mind. From the perspective of epistemology, the first process is far more certain and reliable than the second. The illusion of reliability in the second process comes from the control we have over our own thoughts, which we mistake for control over external reality. This illusion is a legacy of 4 centuries of philosophical subjectivism, which has deeply influenced science and education. Today, people are trained to refine logical reasoning while neglecting the ability to perceive the actual logical connections between facts themselves. There's no discipline dedicated to teaching this skill. Everything is relegated to the realm of intuition or dismissed as subjective. How can we call something objective when it's a construct of our own minds, and something subjective when it directly reflects the objective situation? It's a complete inversion. This is the issue I'm addressing with this experiment. It can be approached in 2 ways. As a psychological technique to enhance the perception of factual connections, or as a broader critique of how modern education prioritizes constructs over reality. We spend so much effort refining reasoning, something a computer can already do better than us. But a computer can never perceive reality as we do. Only a living, real human being, operating as a whole person, with a sense of moral responsibility for understanding reality, can do that. No computer can bear moral responsibility for its knowledge, and if it could, we would have to consider it a being with rights and obligations, a completely absurd notion. Modern education focuses on perfecting functions that machines perform better than humans while neglecting the uniquely human ability to perceive factual connections. When people try to develop this ability, they often frame it within psychological techniques aimed at awakening intuition or opening the third eye, which surround the matter with a misplaced mystical aura. This is completely disconnected from the actual situation. Philosophical training, specifically the training I'm offering in this course, is precisely about refining the perception of factual connections. The difficulty lies in the fact that our minds are so conditioned to construct logical reasoning that when we attempt to focus on the first type of decision-making process, we interfere with it through our reasoning and ruin it. We try to draw logical conclusions before allowing the logic of the facts themselves to reveal something to us. I discussed this in my notes titled Contemplative Humor. Though I didn't frame it in such straightforward terms, this is precisely what I was referring to. Is there a way to make that simpler, faster, and more immediate decision-making process dominant for us? No. There's no technique to achieve this. It cannot be trained or developed directly. It can only happen as an indirect effect of a proper educational formation. That's what I'm trying to accomplish with you here. If you attempt to develop your intuition directly, you'll create a mess. just like the self-help movement does. You'll end up with utter confusion. The spontaneous, passive perception of reality and facts cannot be trained because its substance doesn't come from you. It comes from the facts. The facts are the active side, while you, as the receptor, your body, your so-called adaptive unconscious, as psychologists term it, must have the necessary passivity to accept the facts and perceive them as they are. The training for this, if it were possible, would involve cultivating an attitude of acceptance and contemplation of the facts. However, this cannot be directly trained because it depends on the entire structure of your personality. What we're going to do here is provide you with a type of education that will gradually teach you to accept things as they are and to trust your direct perception more than your reasoning. Reasoning should only be used to verify and confirm what you already know. True knowledge is not something constructed in your mind through reasoning. It is the perception of reality. Knowledge is a direct reaction of a living, real subject to a living, real situation. Because the data in the first type of reasoning are not created by your mind, but given by reality, they are not represented as signs. They are real presences. Therefore, they are inexpressible. You can only express what you've thought about using signs, such as words. This means that the first decision is silent. The first perception is silent. It doesn't rely on signs, so you cannot articulate it or communicate it. Because you cannot articulate it, you feel as though you don't have mastery over the situation. To gain this sense of mastery, you create a mental representation that you fully control because it's your own construction. Upon completing the reasoning process with a conclusion, you believe you've intellectually mastered the matter. However, in the transition from fact to concept and from concept to reasoning, numerous errors can arise. Not just logical errors, but also errors of naming, categorization, classification, and description. You must first describe the elements of the situation to yourself, assign them names, conceptualize them, and then construct a reasoning structure to arrive at a conclusion. The potential for error here is immense. In the first case, where you're dealing directly with the facts, there is almost no room for error because the facts come with their own self-evident, self-revealing connections. The more you can rely on the first form of reasoning, even if it means being unable to articulate or reproduce it, the more firmly anchored you are in the realm of truth and the freer you are from the errors of thought. As the saying goes, he who overthinks perishes. It's true. Most errors don't come from perception. They come from thought. Of course, perception can be mistaken, but the margin for error is much smaller. If perceptual errors occurred as frequently as thought errors, everyday activities like driving would be impossible. Cars would collide constantly. Yet when you consider the vast number of decisions a driver makes in traffic, all accurate, precise, and nearly impossible to articulate or describe, it's clear how much more reliable perception is compared to thought. Now compare that with the absurdities people utter during debates. It becomes evident that the first cognitive function, the one rooted in perception, is far more efficient and reliable than the second, which is based on constructed reasoning. In perception, we can make inductive inferences with incredible precision, remarkable speed, and minimal error. In contrast, in the realm of mental representation and constructive reasoning, errors are abundant even among the greatest philosophers. Why? Because in the domain of constructed reasoning, everything is created by the mind. You're working with a symbolic and often arbitrary connection to reality. Naturally, the margin for error is greater. When we place our trust in the second type of reasoning, because it allows for evidence, reproducibility, and communication with others, we are deluding ourselves. For example, when you construct a reasoning process, express it in words and explain it to others. They can reconstruct the same reasoning and arrive at the same conclusion. Thousands, even millions of people can validate your reasoning and agree with you. But what have they really confirmed? Only the internal logic of your reasoning. Its connection to the facts can be tested through experiments, but these experiments will only approximate the original situation in one or two schematic points. Even experimental verification provides only a limited certainty. And yet, for the past 4 centuries, our civilization has built itself entirely on this limited foundation. For instance, if you witness someone stabbing another person and you're the only witness, you directly perceive the act and its causal connections, the attacker's action, the stab, and its fatal consequence. This isn't mere perception, it's reasoning. But not reasoning done through mental images, signs, or words. It's reasoning done directly with the facts you're perceiving. It's the internal logic of the facts revealing itself to you. If others later question your testimony and demand proof, they will construct countless logical connections and devise experiments to match elements of the original situation. For example, they might confirm that the blood on the knife matches the victim's blood type. But this experimental reconstruction will always be partial and fragmented. To recreate the entire situation, you would need to relive it. Even the elements you verify experimentally will need to be connected through further reasoning, which introduces yet more layers of construction and potential error. Why do we trust this process? First, because we created it, and we feel we have control over our mental constructs. Second, because it can be reproduced by others, who confirm what we're saying. In this way, we value indirect, partial confirmations from 1 million people over the direct and complete display of the fact itself. This is madness. And this madness is what we've called science for the past 4 centuries. Modern science rests on 2 foundations: the greater reliability attributed to indirect construction over direct perception, and the collective validation of reasoning processes by multiple individuals. This collective validation serves the social function of science. It fosters trust in certain shared understandings. But if we're not seeking collective validation, if we're seeking knowledge for ourselves, then it's clear the first mode of knowledge, rooted in direct perception, should matter most to us. This mode can give you total and absolute certainty, but it's nearly impossible to share or communicate this certainty to others. The entire effort of ancient philosophy, at least in Greece, was to enable people to perceive reality directly. Aristotle, who codified logic for the first time, was fully aware that only a small portion of what is perceived in the realm of facts can be transposed into logical demonstration. He understood the distinction between the logical connection between concepts and the factual connection between entities and elements of reality. For example, in the Iowa experiment, the perception that participants had after 10 draws, based on direct interaction with the situation, would have been impossible without the intelligible structure of the data themselves. This demonstrates Aristotle's claim that things have an intelligible form. When we construct a concept, we are attempting to translate into words the intelligible aspect of the objects we perceive. However, concepts remain mental constructs. They represent the object, but do not reproduce it. Representation inherently implies the absence of the object. Concepts are transparent to us because we created them. They offer logical certainty, the certainty of connections between concepts. However, the link between these concepts and reality remains problematic. This is why experimental science exists, to ensure that the logical order we impose on concepts coincides with the order of facts at select points. In the case of the first type of perception, the intelligible form of the objects reveals itself to you fully and immediately. Since you didn't create it, you cannot reproduce it. You can only perceive it in the moment it is presented. Since you didn't create this intelligible structure, you can't reproduce it entirely. What you're perceiving is the logical connection between entities and their intelligible forms, but this connection was created by God. It came from outside you. This is the domain of truth. Truth is the connection between the intelligible forms of beings in themselves. The rest is merely thought. Thought can touch truth at certain points, but it can never fully encompass it. When you study to become a scientist or a philosopher, you're not developing knowledge in the truest sense. Instead, you're developing a language, a way of speaking with others in your field, gaining their confirmation for what you're saying. And the object of your study? The things themselves? They're completely absent from this process. For instance, when you graduate with a degree in mineralogy, there's no actual stone present during your ceremony. Instead, you find yourself among mineralogists, the university rector, and others. This means you're not engaging with the objective reality of your field, but navigating a web of human relationships. You're operating in a subjective, intersubjective domain, not the objective one. The direct objective relationship with reality is personal, intransferable, and silent. It occurs in the moment when the mineralogist picks up a stone, observes it, and it reveals its structure, composition, and something of its origin and history. In that moment, knowledge occurs. Everything that follows, the translation of this knowledge into symbols and human communication, results in immense loss. Years ago, I had to confront this issue myself. Did I want knowledge, or did I want communication? Do I want to know what things truly are, or do I want to produce a discourse that gains approval from others who think they know? You too will face this choice. I realized something important. To know something is to know something others don't. If you only know what others also know, you're operating within a shared, collective slice of reality. But when you're face to face with reality itself, something you didn't create, don't control, and are both in and before, that's where true knowledge happens. The transformation of this direct perception into human language is an exceedingly complex and error-prone process. I had to decide. I would perceive many things with incredible clarity, but wouldn't be able to articulate or prove them. You must make this choice too. You may prove a tiny fraction of what you know, but that's all. For example, a crime witness doesn't need to prove anything. They are the proof. Direct testimonial knowledge constitutes the essence of philosophy. This is why a book of philosophy never says everything it could say. It's why I suggested the exercise of slow reading, complementing texts imaginatively so the very facts from which the philosopher drew their ideas gradually appear to you. Over time, you can develop a significant ability to trace texts back to their experiential origins. This will also help you move in the other direction, from your real-life experiences to culturally effective expression. But just because you can express something effectively doesn't mean you can prove it. Proof is something you offer to others. For example, does a crime witness need proof? No, they possess direct knowledge. Years ago, I wrote a booklet titled Intelligence, Truth and Certainty, where I discussed the pure idea of science as described by Edmund Husserl in First Philosophy. He emphasized that for science to exist, there must be something called evidence. Evidence is the direct perception of something, such as perceiving that I'm here, speaking to you now. Without evidence, all thoughts are doubtful. But evidence only holds value for the one who has it. A crime witness doesn't need proof because they have direct evidence. For everyone else who wasn't there and doesn't know the situation, indirect evidence or proof is required. Proof consists of a series of statements logically connected to the data presented by witnesses and the situation itself. However, the logical connection between premises and conclusion, like in the classic example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Relies on intuitive perception. Logic by itself proves nothing. It merely connects statements, and those connections must themselves be perceived intuitively. This leads to the conclusion that rational knowledge doesn't exist. Only intuitive knowledge exists. Intuitive knowledge involves reasoning, but not with mental signs or constructs created by your mind. Instead, it involves reasoning with the elements of the situation itself. This is what I call radical intuitionism. Rational knowledge doesn't exist, nor does logical knowledge, only intuitive knowledge. The so-called rational is just an intuitive connection between mental constructs you've created. The connection between these constructs can only be perceived intuitively, not logically. For instance, how do I determine that an animal belongs to a specific species? I have the general definition of the species and see that the individual fits within it. This perception isn't rational, it's intuitive. This means that the first type of knowledge, the one reflected in the sweat of your palms, is the only real knowledge. The second type, the constructed reasoning, is merely an effort to convince yourself of something you already know. It's an exercise in self-persuasion, pure rhetoric. This means that the essence of knowledge is individual direct perception, difficult to transmit. What is transmissible and provable is not knowledge itself, but a set of mental constructs that indirectly reference knowledge. This is why, nowadays, the more people study, the more ignorant they become. I once read a story about this. A man visited a museum offering a statue he claimed to have unearthed in Greece. The museum staff tested the stone, and the chemists confirmed it was indeed ancient. The surface had undergone alterations that would have taken millennia to form. The statue seemed authentic. The museum was preparing to purchase it when an old expert said, "There's something wrong with this statue. I don't know what, but something is off." He advised them not to buy it. Since the expert was well respected, the museum decided to hold off. The expert couldn't immediately articulate what he noticed. He was perceiving something, but he didn't yet have the mental symbols to describe it. Later he managed to explain, "This statue doesn't have a consistent style. It combines elements from different periods, which would have been impossible in ancient Greece. Only a modern forger could have created this mix." To fully grasp this, one would need extensive familiarity with the history of Greek styles, not from reading, but from seeing and internalizing their forms. The expert's perception was nearly impossible to prove to others, and yet his knowledge was rooted in undeniable certainty based on the real data before him. Over time, additional evidence emerged. Forged documents and other details that proved the statue was fake. If the museum had ignored the old expert and trusted only the chemists, they would have bought a counterfeit for millions of dollars, leading to scandal and disgrace. Thankfully, in the art world, the authority of the connoisseur, the one who perceives directly, even without scientific proof, still holds weight. This kind of expertise cannot be easily proven or transmitted. But that doesn't mean it's any less precise than scientific knowledge. In fact, it's often more so. The intrinsic validity of knowledge has nothing to do with the social authority of its transmission. Yet today, we are taught to conflate the two. We've come to believe that what can be scientifically verified and repeated by many people is more reliable than what we see with our own eyes. This absurdity has even led us to think that science can correct our perceptions. This is a total alienation and deeply irrational. Years ago, I faced this dilemma. Did I want self-evident, firm knowledge, or did I want knowledge that was easy to communicate and socially accepted? Do you want genuine knowledge or currency in the intellectual market? The latter is easy to share and gain approval for, but lacks the real substance of direct perception. In our society, the criteria for knowledge are entirely inverted. We place maximum trust in what is least reliable and minimal trust in what is most reliable. We confuse the certainty of direct knowledge with the conditions of its easy transmission. The capacity to perceive direct factual relationships doesn't need to remain unconscious. In the Iowa experiment, the researchers analyzed it as unconscious perception. But if the process had been conscious, would it have changed anything? Of course not. The difference isn't between conscious and unconscious processes, but between reasoning with the raw data of reality and reasoning with mental signs. In one case, the reasoning lies in the structure of the events themselves. In the other, it exists solely in your brain. Why would the latter be more trustworthy? It makes no sense. The second type of reasoning isn't more reliable, it's simply easier to reproduce. It becomes a kind of currency, something others can confirm, but it will never achieve the level of certainty provided by direct observation. Over the past 4 centuries, we've relegated direct observation to mere raw material for constructing logical reasoning, as if it weren't reasoning in itself, as if it were irrational. For example, a witness who sees a murder, the stab, the victim's death, has only irrational knowledge, while the legal proofs constructed around it are considered rational. Clearly, when a participant in the Iowa experiment realizes the red decks are biased, they've reasoned rationally and with perfect logical structure. They just didn't conduct this reasoning in their head with mental symbols. They did it with their eyes, using the actual data of the situation. This is the highest certainty we can achieve, and it places us in the domain of truth. When you attempt to prove something, you're no longer in the domain of truth. You're in the domain of its representation. Each of you must decide, do you want to live within truth, or do you want to live in the realm of representation, subjectivity, and discourse, even if that discourse is collectively validated? The dominant culture of the past 4 centuries is deeply flawed in this respect. The more refined the university system becomes, with more money and power, the worse this issue grows. It creates larger communities of people validating each other's mental constructs. This cannot be corrected within the establishment. We must correct it individually, within ourselves. Especially in the English-speaking world, debates often revolve around the so-called 2 cultures: the scientific culture and the literary culture. Saul Bellow famously distinguished between writers and intellectuals. Intellectuals are those who create ideas, doctrines, and hypotheses and engage in discussions. Writers, on the other hand, attempt to express genuine impressions as directly as possible. Genuine impressions are akin to what your hand feels when it starts to sweat as you approach the red cards. But of course, this entire debate is fundamentally flawed. Everything related to direct perception is relegated to the realm of literature, art, religion, mysticism, and what is dismissively labeled as irrational. Conversely, everything related to science no longer involves direct observation, but instead consists of doctrines, hypotheses, proofs, and so forth. This way of framing the problem is completely misguided. The real distinction isn't between conscious and unconscious or rational and irrational. It lies between the logical connections revealed by the facts themselves and their subsequent mental imitation. Because the logical connection perceived immediately in the facts cannot be directly transmitted, it can only be shared in 2 ways: by converting it into concepts and constructing reasoning, or by representing it symbolically. Both methods are indirect. In this sense, literature is no closer to real experience than science is. It too is a symbolic transformation. The real perception remains incommunicable. You might have analogous or even identical experiences to someone else, but not the specific experience in question. However, the possibility of constructing shared reasoning from experience exists precisely because the experience itself already reveals an internal logical connection. This logical connection within the real world is what we call divine reason, not your reason. Our reasoning has value only insofar as it indirectly refers to this original divine reason. If there were no internal connections between the facts, all the connections we create in our minds would be artificial and false. Nonetheless, the mental connections we create can never fully reproduce the structure of reality. To achieve this, we would have to recreate the entire event as it originally unfolded. The internal logic of reality reveals itself only in the moment it occurs, exactly as it occurs. It cannot be appropriated by us. For us to appropriate it, we would have to grasp the totality of the rational structure of reality, effectively seizing the logos of God. This would mean becoming God, which is, of course, impossible. Instead, we operate in a blasphemous inversion. We begin to value the mental structures we create more than the rational structure of reality as it presents itself in objects. We call this science, philosophy, art, and so on. This is what Bruno Tolentino meant by the world as an idea. People don't want the world, they want their idea of the world. This idea gives them a sense of security precisely because they created it. You become the omnipotent ruler of your subjective world, the world of your ideas. But you're not even the ruler of your entire subjective world, only the part you've constructed mentally. That's why you choose it. Because you don't dominate the rest. At that moment, you become a perfect idiot. The great cultural perversion is the dominance of proof over reality, of the sign over the meaning. This is precisely what we must avoid, and philosophy exists as a remedy for this. It was invented as a cure. In the Socratic dialogues, Socrates constantly draws people back from their world of ideas to the world of real experience. This is what we must do continually for ourselves. But give up trying to refine direct perception. It cannot be refined. There are no exercises for this because it is already perfect. Perception of reality is knowledge itself. You are the one who must be refined. You must cultivate your personality to accept the reality presented to you. This is a lifelong task. This is precisely what we're trying to accomplish here. Creating a new kind of education that dismantles the authority of hypnotic cultural constructs in people's minds and replaces it with the authority of reality itself. In the moment when your hand starts sweating as it touches the red cards, you are in the fullness of reality. You are perceiving what is truly happening, because you are perceiving with the elements of the situation, not mental constructs. You cannot mentally repeat the experience. To do so, you must convert it into a mental scheme. The certainty of that scheme relates to the experience, but does not reproduce it. It merely represents it. Representation is not the same as reproduction. The more you can adhere to this immediate perception without resorting to reasoning, the better for you. Reasoning is laborious, complicated, slow, and error-prone. A culture that prioritizes proof over knowledge is a deeply perverted culture. No proof offers absolute certainty. Only direct perception provides absolute certainty. If you constantly demand proof and reject direct perception, you're not seeking knowledge at all. You're merely looking for a socially approved excuse to believe in something. In this sense, the demand for proof becomes a refuge in authority, an argument from authority in disguise. This is the real issue. When you demand proof, especially in this sense, it becomes a way of avoiding knowledge and seeking shelter in authority. It's nothing but a disguised argument from authority. Years ago, I wrote a booklet called Intelligence, Truth and Certainty, in which I outlined the fundamental elements of the pure idea of science, as described by Edmund Husserl in his book, First, philosophy. The first condition for science to exist is the presence of evidence. Evidence is the direct perception of something. For example, I perceive that I'm here speaking to you now. If evidence didn't exist, all thought would be doubtful. But evidence only holds value for the person experiencing it. A crime witness, for instance, doesn't need proof because they have direct knowledge of the event. They can, however, be used as an element of proof. For those who weren't present, who didn't see or experience anything, proof becomes necessary. Proof consists of statements logically connected to the data presented by witnesses and the context of the event. However, the logical connection between premises and conclusion, for example, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, depends on evidence itself. Logic on its own proves nothing. It merely creates connections between statements, and even these connections must be perceived intuitively. This means that rational knowledge doesn't truly exist. What exists is intuitive knowledge. By intuitive knowledge, I mean reasoning that occurs not with signs or mental constructs created by your mind, but directly with the elements of the situation itself. This is what I call radical intuitionism. Rational knowledge doesn't exist, only intuitive knowledge does. Rationality is nothing more than an intuitive connection between mental constructs. The connection itself can only be perceived intuitively, not logically. For example, how do I recognize that an animal belongs to a specific species? I rely on the general definition of the species and intuitively perceive that the individual matches this definition. This process isn't rational. It's intuitive. This demonstrates that the first type of knowledge, the one that makes your hand sweat when you pick a red card, is the only real knowledge. The second type, based on constructed reasoning, is merely an effort to persuade yourself of something you already know. It's an exercise in self-persuasion, pure rhetoric. The essence of knowledge, therefore, lies in individual, direct perception, which is inherently difficult to transmit. The true foundation of knowledge lies not in proofs or demonstrations, but in evidence, direct evidence that reality offers to you. Modern science has been alienated from this foundation. It depends on constructing representations, and its entire system of validation relies on collective agreement about these representations. The dominance of collective validation over individual perception is the heart of modern intellectual perversion. It prioritizes conformity to communal constructs over personal engagement with reality. To break free from this, you must re-center yourself in direct personal experience. This doesn't mean rejecting science, but understanding its limitations. Science can serve as a tool to refine specific aspects of knowledge, but it cannot replace the direct experience of reality. In fact, the more advanced and complex science becomes, the further it moves from direct experience. The greater the reliance on abstract constructs, the weaker the connection to reality. If you let this dominate your life, you become trapped in a symbolic world, disconnected from what is real. This is the essence of intellectual alienation. This alienation isn't inevitable. It's a choice we make when we prioritize representations over reality, signs over meaning, and proof over direct perception. To overcome this alienation, we must cultivate the habit of engaging with reality as it is, rather than constantly trying to fit it into predefined constructs. This requires humility, a willingness to accept that reality is far greater, more complex, and more profound than anything we can encapsulate in our minds. It also requires courage, because the immediate perception of reality can be unsettling. It challenges our preconceived notions and forces us to confront the limits of our understanding. Modern education, however, does the opposite. It trains us to value the constructs of the mind over the direct evidence of reality. It encourages us to trust in collective validation rather than personal perception. This is why, despite all the advancements in technology and science, people today often feel more disconnected from reality than ever before. The solution isn't to abandon science or intellectual endeavors. Instead, we must reorient these pursuits so that they serve as tools for engaging with reality rather than as substitutes for it. Philosophy plays a critical role in this process. It's not just an intellectual discipline, but a way of life, a practice of aligning oneself with the truth of existence. Philosophy teaches us to question not only the world around us, but also the assumptions and constructs within our own minds. It helps us see through the illusions created by culture, language, and ideology, bringing us back to the immediacy of reality. The ultimate goal of this education is to restore the authority of reality itself. It's not about rejecting reasoning or intellectual constructs, but about putting them in their proper place, as tools, not as masters. This requires a profound shift in perspective. It's not something that can be achieved through techniques or exercises alone. It involves a transformation of the entire person. You must become someone who is open to the truth, willing to let go of illusions, and capable of living in alignment with reality. This transformation is the work of a lifetime, but it begins with small steps. Learning to trust your perceptions, to engage with the world directly, and to question the constructs that mediate your experience. When you do this, you begin to see the world not as an idea, but as it truly is. You step out of the prison of representation and into the freedom of reality. This is the essence of philosophy, not as a body of knowledge, but as a way of being. It's the practice of aligning oneself with the truth and living in the light of reality. Only in this way can we overcome the alienation of modern culture and rediscover what it means to truly know, to truly live, and to truly be. This process of reorienting ourselves toward reality requires that we abandon the idea that knowledge is merely a collection of facts or proofs. Knowledge is not a product. It is an act, a living engagement with the truth. Modern culture often treats knowledge as if it were something external, something we accumulate and possess. But true knowledge is transformative. It changes us, shapes our perceptions, and deepens our connection to reality. This is why the great philosophers emphasize the ethical dimension of knowledge. Knowing the truth is not just an intellectual achievement, it is a moral responsibility. To know is to be responsible for what you perceive and how you act upon it. This responsibility is inseparable from the act of knowing itself. When you perceive the truth, you are called to align your life with it. To ignore this call is to live in bad faith, to choose illusion over reality. Modern education, however, often divorces knowledge from responsibility. It trains people to think critically, to analyze and construct arguments, but it rarely teaches them how to live in accordance with the truth. This is why so many educated people today are profoundly disconnected from reality. They possess an abundance of information, but lack wisdom. They know how to manipulate signs and symbols, but have lost the ability to see the world as it truly is. To reclaim this ability, we must cultivate a different kind of education, one that prioritizes direct engagement with reality over the mastery of abstract constructs. This is not to say that reasoning and analysis are unimportant. They have their place, but they must always serve the deeper goal of aligning ourselves with the truth. The first step in this process is learning to trust your perceptions. This doesn't mean blindly accepting everything you see or hear. It means developing the discernment to recognize what is real and what is not. This discernment comes from experience, from living in the world and paying close attention to the relationships between things. It also requires humility, the willingness to admit when you are wrong and to revise your understanding in light of new evidence. Philosophy, in its truest sense, is the cultivation of this discernment. It is not about constructing elaborate systems of thought, but about learning to see clearly and to live truthfully. This kind of education is not easy. It requires effort, patience, and a willingness to question everything you think you know. But it is also profoundly liberating. When you begin to see the world as it truly is, you are no longer bound by the illusions and distortions of modern culture. You become free to live in alignment with reality, to know the truth and act upon it. This is the ultimate goal of philosophy, not to provide answers, but to teach you how to ask the right questions, to guide you toward a deeper understanding of yourself and the world around you. In this way, philosophy is not just an intellectual pursuit, but a way of life. It is the practice of living in truth, of aligning yourself with the reality that transcends all human constructs. This is the path we must follow if we are to overcome the alienation of modern culture and rediscover the fullness of life.